Harald's hand truly looked like a fist. His fingers were thick, his knuckles cracked, and his skin had hardened with the scars of old wars. His broken nose sat crooked at the center of his face, and his beard, somewhere between red and black, moved slowly with the wind. He was 35, yet the years made him look older. Nearly 2 meters tall, with shoulders as wide as a shield, his gaze was as cold as a winter night. In his village they called him Iron Fist, because with one punch he could break a man's jaw, and with a single stare he could end a fight before it began. But after that winter, Harald's fist was no longer enough. Last winter, an enemy clan had reached the shore with their long ships. They attacked before the fog lifted, burned the huts, and mixed the screams with the howling wind. Harald fought, striking down 3 men with his axe. But when he reached the village, the flames had already risen. His wife and his 7-year-old son were gone. The boy still held a small wooden sword, as if he had tried to fight like his father. That night, Harald drove his fist into the wall of his hut. The wood cracked, his bones bled, but his son's body remained cold. When he knelt before the graves, he did not speak. No tears fell from his eyes. Only one thought echoed within him. This vengeance will be taken. From that day on, Harald's voice was no longer heard in the village. For days he sharpened his axe. The winter was harsh. Snow bent the roofs of huts, and the wind turned the sea to ice. When spring came and everyone returned to fishing and farming, Harald began building a ship alone. He called no one to help. Vengeance could not be shared. No one else's oar could match his fury. Months later, the awaited day arrived. The sea was rough and the wind cut like a blade. Harald pushed his ship into the water and began to row alone. The first days passed in silence. Only the sound of waves and the rhythm of the oars remained. On the 3rd night, a storm rose. The sky darkened in an instant, and the wind bent the mast. Waves tossed the ship like a toy, yet Harald did not release the oars. When a wave crashed over the deck, he fell to his knees. The icy water cut through his lungs. At that moment, a dark silhouette appeared through the storm. Another ship emerging from the shadows. Pirates, or scouts from another clan. Harald silently took his axe. 2 men from the foreign vessel tried to approach when they saw he was alone. They threw a hook, and the ships scraped against each other. Harald leapt forward before they could move. A short but brutal fight erupted on the narrow deck. He split the first man's shoulder with his axe and punched the second into the sea. The waves swallowed him whole. Harald gasped for breath, but he had saved his ship. The storm lasted until dawn. Part of the mast broke and his hands were covered in blood. Still, he kept rowing. On the 7th day, a heavy fog fell. Harald thought he had lost his way. For a moment, he thought he heard his son's voice. When he lifted his head, there was no one, only endless white. He let go of the oars and closed his eyes. Rage and longing tangled inside him. Then he stood straight again and continued his journey. After 2 weeks, the shore of enemy lands appeared as the sun set. He quietly pulled the ship onto the sand. Only the sound of waves and the whisper of the wind surrounded him. When he found the path to the fortress, guards were speaking around a fire. He silently struck the first down with his axe. The second tried to shout, but Harald's fist crushed his throat. Blood splashed across his face like warm mist, yet he never stopped moving. The fortress gate was made of thick oak. Harald swung his axe. The wood cracked, and with the second strike, the lock shattered. Echoing footsteps inside announced that the battle had begun. In the corridors, he brought down every man who stood before him, some with his axe, some with his fists. His breathing grew heavier, but his eyes remained cold. When the door to Jarl Bjorn's chamber opened, he saw a massive shadow waiting within. The Jarl was tall and broad-shouldered, a shining sword in his hand. When he smiled, his teeth looked like those of a wolf. Harald dropped his axe to the floor and clenched his fists. As the fight began, the sound of steel struck the walls. The Jarl's blade cut Harald's arm, and blood flowed like a warm line. But Harald did not step back. He moved forward and drove his fist into the Jarl's face. The sound of bone echoed. The Jarl staggered, but attacked again. When Harald's second punch landed, the Jarl fell to his knees. Harald climbed on top of him. Every strike carried the silent oath he had made at the graves. With the final blow, the Jarl's neck snapped, and the room fell into silence. Harald stood up, breathing heavily. The chamber smelled of blood. He picked up his axe and left the fortress without looking back. Night had fallen, and the sea was dark and calm. He returned to his ship and began to row once more. Days later, when he reached his own shore, the village still stood, but its old joy was gone. Harald entered his hut. He found his son's small wooden sword, placed it before him, and stared at it for a long time. The vengeance had been taken, but the emptiness inside him remained. From that day on, Harald never spoke again. People said they often saw him sitting alone by the shore, watching the waves. His fists still tightened, his breath heavy as if he were fighting an invisible enemy. Because now he knew, vengeance is not an ending, only the beginning of another silence.